Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 219 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on September 19th, 2020. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com. I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime, and joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, I suppose there was a bit of a change of plan on this show, because I think on the last show I announced it as like we're going to do a Turf Wars re-review, but Greg informed me just a day before we were about to record that I think we've already done this, and we had in fact already done that on episode 214, so we didn't want to do that again, of course. So instead, what this show is going to be is mainly a preview show for the next Avatar comic, which is Avatar The Last Airbender, Katara and the Pirate Silver. So most of the show is going to be going over preview pages for that, speculation and discussion on what we think will happen in the book. But we do have one piece of news to cover first, which is just that Dark Horse Comics posted about a week ago on their Twitter this notice to everyone, basically. Due to the destructive fire sweeping across our state, the Dark Horse Comics offices in Milwaukee, Oregon, are in a level 1 evacuation zone, non-urgent but prepared for potential evacuation. However, many of our employees in the surrounding areas have been forced to evacuate their homes. Please be patient with delays from Dark Horse Comics staff at this time. While we continue to be fully operational, we are encouraging staff to take care of themselves and their families first. So a lot of people were wondering, is this going to affect dates for any of the upcoming comics and stuff like that? Obviously, reading into that statement is that right now there's no delays as such that they're announcing, but that if it does get more serious, they're going to prioritize their staff over everything, so there might be delays. I think the Runes of the Empire Library Edition bookstore date has changed by a week, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily because of this. My copy has it's heading to the place that's going to ship it out to me, so I don't think where I ordered it from is delayed, and I probably should have it next week, but a lot of places are saying September 29th, so I'm not sure how this is going to affect stuff going forward, because there is quite a few Avatar books coming out over the next couple of weeks. The Search Omnibus Edition is going to be coming out. The second edition of the Avatar art book is going to be coming out, and the short story collection, the two of them together as a library edition, that's also going to be coming out basically within the next month and a half. So I don't really know the full story on this. I don't think things should be affected that much. I'd be more worried if we were dealing with single issue stuff here, but I don't think it affects most of the stuff that we'd be talking about here. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think we'll see any delays to the books coming out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure on that. I mean, it seems like, depending on, I guess, if stuff is already in the distribution houses and if it's already sort of in progress, I guess you would expect there wouldn't be as much of a day, but maybe potentially for anything that we've been waiting on, that's probably what I would be, interested in knowing, if that would be more delayed, even though we don't have too much information on that as of now.
Yeah, the book we're talking about today, Katara and the Pirate Silver, is out October 13th in regular bookstores and online and stuff like that, and then October 14th in comic book stores. They're still saying that that's the date, and that we're under a month away at this point. We'll see how exactly that goes. I don't really know what the situation is in that, are they going to change the digital release date for this book just because the physical copies might be slightly delayed? I'm not really sure how exactly that all works. But obviously this book has been done for quite a while. It's obviously been printed weeks ago at this point. So I don't think this should create too much of a delay. So I wouldn't be too worried about the Katara book date slipping really at this point. But yeah, that's really all the news there's been. Again, we're still waiting to see whenever they announce the next Korra comic and so on. But this is the book that's out next, Katara and the Pirate Silver. So I'll just read out the description for the book, because again, we talked about this ages ago, but it's been a while. It's sink or swim for Katara. When Team Avatar is suddenly ambushed by the Fire Nation, Katara gets separated from the group. Unable to rendezvous with Aang, Toph, and Sokka, Katara must avoid capture by aligning herself with some unlikely allies. The normally sweet and sensitive Katara will need to explore her tougher side if she's going to reunite with the rest of Team Avatar. I suppose the preview pages that we now have pretty much cover everything that's included in the description now. We know the full setup for why this story is happening, and we have now met the pirate group that she's going to actually interact with. So I don't think there's really too much to go into with the description. So I think the first thing is just, we're under a month away from this book. What is your excitement level at going into this first one-shot Avatar comic?
I think now, after having read these newer, or the extended sort of intro preview pages, I'm a little bit more interested in it. I think it has some extra little tidbits, maybe not as much as far as Katara and her sort of character building, since we do kind of know where that ends up, but that's just sort of like an unfortunate fact of this story being sort of in the middle of things. But I think in the preview there's some little extra bits that are, I guess, at least a little bit more interesting than what we knew before, just based off of like the description and a couple of the other earlier pages. So I don't know, I think I'm still not sort of as hyped as I would have been if this was like a 3-part series that had some either for like the continuation of the whole sort of like comic book series or something else down the line. But I think it's risen maybe a notch or two more than before, which maybe wasn't that high to begin with.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I was not particularly excited for this after like the first preview and just the announcement of this book. I felt a little bit better about it now that we sort of know there's like a secondary plot. I don't know how in depth they're going to get into it, but there is something else going on apart from just Katara with the pirates. But yeah, deciding, I think, just in general, the core of this story, to set it, I suppose we now officially know from the opening pages, it's set in between Bitter Work and the library. I just think it doesn't really leave a lot of room for anything particularly notable to happen, in that we'll get into it here, but the secondary plot that's kind of more interesting, I'm worried about how they're going to do it, just because it might, I don't think continuity error is the correct problem, but it's like it's rubbing up against stuff that happens in book 3 a little bit, and I'm worried about how they're going to tackle that, when the whole aim of setting it during Avatar was that you weren't going to have to tackle continuity error stuff. So
Yeah.
I just don't get why they needed to set it at this point, and that I think you could have had the same core of this story of Katara has to do something on her own, but it be set during the comic time period that we're actually interested in. You just have to create different threats for why Katara would be separated from the group and so on. But it's fine. And I think the main thing that I've seen people say is that, like, if this was an additional book along with a trilogy that's set post after Imbalance, no, there'd be no problem. People have no problems whatsoever. But the fact that they've replaced that stuff seemingly with these is kind of where the problem is, and that we're literally going backwards instead of going forwards, which is what everyone wants. And already we were beginning to become a bit frustrated with how slowly forward we're going, and now we're literally going backwards again. So I'm hoping they do make some announcements on just comics in general soon, because I just have a slight feeling that this one's going to go kind of the way of Team Avatar Tales, where it'll come out, it'll be exciting for about a day, and then it pretty much won't ever really be talked about again, because I don't know if anything particularly substantial is going to happen in the book. But we'll get into it. So I suppose the opening preview pages here are basically that, we find out immediately that Toph says, being chased by a homicidal Fire Nation princess and spending most of yesterday stuck in a hole is the life to you. And Sokka has obviously said something on the very first comic page of the book, and he says, no, that stuff, this, sailing through the clouds, blue skies, and the wind of my hair, that's what he's talking about. So this immediately says, okay, this is set after Bitter Work, which is when Sokka was in the hole, and they even referenced the moose lion later on. So there's our exact location in book 2. What are your thoughts on where they've chose to set the book?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it works as far as like them traveling in between like specific spots. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's interesting just the fact that they chose this in general as far as like where they thought that there was like a gap enough that there would be like an interesting story that could be told. I mean, I don't know, there's like so many different places, throughout the whole, course of all the 3 books that they could have used, and this was just the one that they chose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it is interesting in that I guess the library does just open up like in the middle of a field, basically. So it probably is the best point in book 2 to place it, because once you start the library, that whole series of events basically leaves no gap, unless you're going to set it in the sort of Tales of Ba Sing Se gap, which again you have to be in the city to do that. So to have Toph as part of the team and have a story with her, it kind of had to be here. So I think that makes logical sense what they've done here. But pretty much immediately we get into the dynamic, which is the setup for Katara's arc here, which is basically that, okay, again, going off stuff from the chase, Katara and Toph in the early days are having a lot of arguments with each other because they have different approaches. She criticizes the group overall, but I suppose mainly Katara for like, why are you being so relaxed when we've just been chased by the Fire Nation? And she's like, no, I'm just being realistic. And Katara argues back that you haven't been with us enough. Like, we know how serious it is, but we can take breaks when we need to. We're not ignoring what's happening. It's just, finding the right balance. And they get into this whole idea of, okay, they have different approaches. They think differently than each other. And she points out that, oh, look, take the way we both thought Aang bending. You taught him water bending by gently showing him how to guide the flow of water. I chucked rocks at his head. You told me to use positive reinforcement. There was a little bit of that, but I did a lot more rock chucking, and Aang agrees with this. And they immediately, I suppose, get into addressing her personality here. It's fine. I'm a very direct person. You're well, and Sokka says it for us, soft and gentle like a croco kitten before its skin gets all tough and scaly. And this is when they directly bring up, Aang still learned both earth and water bending. The only real difference is that when I thought he learned earth bending in a day, it took him, a couple of weeks to learn water bending. And Katara's whole point here is that she's not super soft and like cuddly like a croco kitten. She's still a good teacher. And Aang ultimately is just like, it's fine. It's fine that you were like that and you're different than Toph. And Katara takes like, she says, why does it feel like it's not okay that there is this difference between them? And that seems to be the core setup here. It's just that Toph has made Katara feel like she's too kind and caring. Whereas, I suppose, like, it's not the best setup here, ultimately, in that the only real takeaway from the end of this book probably is going to be that, like, oh yeah, Katara can be tough, but we know already she can be tough, because at this stage in the story, she's like confronted Paku, had a fight with him, she's fought with Zuko, and all this other stuff. We've seen now that she's a waterbending master. She can really, really prove herself. So it's definitely a like almost out of nowhere plot in a way. But what are your thoughts on what they're going for with the character arc setup for Katara here?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because we do know that she's tough and she has like, at this point she's, fully skilled. I mean, she's still, developing as a waterbender in general, but she's still, at this point she's quite advanced. She's nowhere near where she was, in book 1 or anything like that. So I don't know. It's interesting to hear this. I mean, I guess from Toph's perspective, relative to her, she's softer, or just, I guess just sort of the idea of, water bending in general and how it's sort of taught, is sort of like, the mindset, which is sort of what they're getting at here, it's just a different point of view of how to do things. So that seems to be sort of what they're trying to go here. And I guess Toph doesn't have as much of understanding of everything that Qatar has gone through up until this point. So from her perspective, it seems more soft, but I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, like I still we saw this in the first preview, but I still sort of have an issue with the dialogue of like Toph saying, "I thought him earthbending in a day. It took him a couple of weeks to learn waterbending." Just because,
Yeah.
like, what do you mean by that? Because if bitter work has like literally just happened, Aang only does one bit of earthbending right at the end. Otherwise, he doesn't earthbend the whole episode. Like, it takes him a full day to even do any earthbending. Whereas back in book one, Aang learned the few waterbending moves that Katara had to teach him in seconds. Like he didn't take any amount of time to adapt to it. And are they trying
Nope.
to say that bitter work, just the training beforehand, was enough to where Aang is now like a competent earthbender after just one day? I think that's a bit of a stretch. I get they're just trying to have Toph be like really confident and kind of bragging about it,
Yeah.
but there's so much like extra context and nuance to all of this, and the fact that like Katara was a complete novice and was just teaching him the few moves she knew at the time, whereas like Toph is an earthbending master teaching him. So I don't know. What's your take on that line?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something to consider here. I mean, Katara didn't have a waterbending master at all. I mean, all she knew was like from trial and error and, the scroll that they had. So, there's no, I don't know, it's not really, like you said, a completely fair, comparison in that regard. I mean, after the fact, like where she's at now, if it took the same amount of time, then yeah, I could see that being an issue. But even still, I mean, Aang still isn't at this point. He's really good at waterbending, but he's not. No, he's not at the same level as far as like determination and skill. At least from the little bit that we've seen with him sort of slacking off in the training when they were at the Northern Warden tribe. So even as far as waterbending goes, he probably needs some more work as well. So yeah, it's. I mean, I get it. Like you said, it's Toph just being sort of like her normal character, but it's not completely, I guess, to the point at this junction.
Mm. Yeah, because it is weird because like you wouldn't say like Aang becomes like a master of earth and waterbending until like right towards the end. But even then, towards the end, I think both of them still sort of note that like we wouldn't quite consider you a master. There's still a little bit more for you to learn. But I think it's the same with Katara. Like I think most people view Katara as being a master like at this point. But would you really say she's quite at the level of like Paku this early in book two? It's more towards the end, I guess, that she gets there. It's just the vagueness of like what it means to be a master and not, and so on, and what is technical
Yeah.
mastery and what isn't, and so on. Because like when you get into those discussions with people online, you get weird situations where it's just like oh Mako's not a firebending master. How dare you say that? And it's just like the show literally calls Zhao a firebending master. If he's a master, then Mako's like a super master. If we're talking about things that way, and then like Toph, I suppose technically has no formal training, but she's like the best Earthbender in the entire series. So there's weird things like that. Like Aang's a airbending master, but has only mastered like what 35 of the 36 airbending tests or whatever that thing is from that obscure book. Um,
Yeah.
it's a weird one because like Aang uses his waterbending in book one shortly after learning the little bits that he knows. Like they both use it in the waterbending master. Shortly after learning those moves, he does use his earthbending in like the drill. I can't remember specifically. Does he do any much earthbending in the Serpent's Pass? I think he does a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Yeah, so he's still like he's all right even just after learning it. And I don't know. I think they typically in the show just take the approach that if it's especially with the Avatar, if it's not your first element once you get the core of it, you're used to the idea of like learning a technique, so it's not as difficult, which I think is why Aang coming in as an airbending master helps him to just immediately adapt to the other elements once he gets over any sort of like philosophical issue with how it's done. Um, because he knows what it is to be like a bender and so on. And I think this is roughly the explanation people use for how like Zahir is so skilled at airbending despite being a non-bender his whole life. Because he's a martial artist, he can adapt to it fairly quickly. But yeah, it's just, I would have liked a little bit more depth given to that, that like Katara doesn't like fire back, that like that's not exactly what happened and so on. But we'll move on. So we find out that the situation that causes Katara to be separated from the group is this. So they've just been talking about how, you know, we need to be cautious, the Fire Nation are after us, and boom, fire catapults go straight by them, and Aang has to pull up really quickly. Katara, who was noting that, you know, they can be more relaxed at certain times, isn't holding on, so she falls off. So they're just pointing out that, oh, Toph was kind of a little bit right at the start because Katara's the one to fall off, but she falls into a sort of ravine and uses waterbending to save herself. I really like the art on the water and stuff like that. The moves that she does here, they give time to showing that like she falls into a pretty raging river here and has to protect herself. So she makes a ball of ice around herself, and it sort of ricochets down off a waterfall into a cliff, and she eventually comes up on the shore. So they get across here that she covers a pretty large distance in quite a large amount of in quite a short amount of time, which is why the group loses sight of her in the air and can't like immediately locate her. So what are your thoughts on how they actually separate Katara from the group here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it works. I mean, it's sort of what we've seen before with sort of the fireballs launching. I mean, I think if anyone who's watched the show has a pretty good idea of how that works in the air, so that all seems pretty plausible. And we have, I think, what was it, Sokka who fell off a bit before? So that seems completely plausible. Yeah, it definitely is. I do agree. I do like how they showed the way of her actually sort of bending the ice spear around herself to sort of protect herself from going through sort of the raging water. I think she probably would still be more hurt than what they sort of show her, but it works for what they're going for.
Yeah, because I suppose just think about the physics of it. Like, okay, she smashes into a wall really hard, but she's still inside like hard ice, so she would still hit off the side of the ice unless she's doing some like weird water cushioning on the inside. But I guess it makes sense. She knows what she's doing. That said, she does come out of it and just sort of like face plants in the ground, so I guess she was sort of like knocked around a bit, which I suppose makes sense. And that I don't know if they quite imply when they come back around to her. Yeah, she's kind of rubbing her head when she gets back up, so I guess she did take a few knocks on the way down. So, you know, it's pretty realistic. But the other plot that we get here is, of course, they're trying to find Katara. So they land Appa kind of nearby, roughly the direction that she went. And I like this that Toph is like, you know, stop yelling, but Sokka is all protective here. Don't tell me not to yell. My sister's gone, and if yelling helps me find her. But they come across the catapults that were firing at them, and so they have to be quiet. So they go back to try and hide, but they find one of the Fire Nation soldiers basically having his lunch on his own, and so there's an awkward moment, and he tries to fight, but immediately Toph just deals with him. He comes back, does some firebending, but Toph further deals with him, and so we just get this situation where, you know, they've basically captured this one individual Fire Nation soldier, and they're now going to have a bit of a conversation with him. So this is the interesting thing here. The guy says, "You may escape today, but tomorrow the Fire Nation will find you. We'll never stop until the world is safe from your malice, Avatar." And Toph has the typical response to this, which is like, yeah, you just keep saying whatever you're saying. But Aang is like, wait, malice? What did I ever do to you? And this is where we get the really interesting part for me from the preview. You know what you did, you and the Air Nomads. You were plotting to take over the world. That's why the Fire Nation had to stop you. And Aang's like, you can't believe that. It's the truth. And Aang says it's a lie. So prove it. And Aang, you can tell from the look on his face, wants to prove it. So I actually really like this, that they're further addressing this. Aang sort of being, defensive about his people, but also Aang just talking about his people. Um, it's surprising how little it's brought up, particularly, because it at least borders on touching on the Air Nomad genocide here. But in this case, it's more about how the Fire Nation kind of propaganda, how it teaches its people about what happened with the Air Nomad genocide. In that, how does a nation basically eliminate another nation, and then it becomes history that it was a good thing to do from their point of view. And I suppose that's potentially what we're going to get into here. And I didn't expect them to bring this up, but it's also kind of interesting. It's just like, yeah, have they ever just randomly talked to one of these soldiers? Not really. And here's what we're getting. So what are your thoughts on this as sort of the side plot in this book?
Yeah, so this was definitely one of the parts, I guess, of this one that really got me sort of interested in it. I mean, I'm really curious to how in depth that they go, because it could, mess up some things with what we have already, what's already been established. But the idea that they are taking this sort of side plot, and I think it's pretty safe to assume that Aang's going to try in some way to convince this one person different. Whether it'll work out in the end, or will it actually mean anything in the grand scheme of things, I would probably think not. But just the idea of getting this sort of what is the history that the Fire Nation is being told. We know a little bit from like the headband and Aang working with the students of the potential Air Nation army that they supposedly had and stuff like that. But there's no, how would anybody in the Fire Nation be able to say different from what they've been learning via the history? It can be, at some point it can be revised in any sort of way that it really needs to be. That's just sort of a issue with history, and who's telling the history. Even the Kyoshi books goes into a little bit about that at the end of the second book, as far as like what will future generations know, and we know that things actually have turned out differently. So that's definitely an interesting bit that we have here. I'm really curious to see how in depth that they go with this.
Yeah, that's my thing here. Is like, what is Aang going to try and say? Like, I guess he's going to do the same thing he does in the headband, of like basically trying to say that like we're nomads. Like, how would we attempt to take over the world? We're monks, and so on. And what point is he going to use to counter that? Because in many ways, like what's happened here seemingly is that they've done the reverse here, of like the Air Nomads knew just prior to the genocide happening that the Fire Nation were planning something, but now it's history that like the Fire Nation were stopping the Air Nomads from doing something similar. That's kind of interesting. We also know that like Sozin basically stopped history at him, and so it's a borderline impossible in the Fire Nation to access history from before him, and I assume that just relates to all of the nations. I guess it was harder to deal with initially during his era, like after the genocide first happened, in terms of like how do you keep that secret from the world, what you've just done? But as it goes on after that, and there's barely any air nomads to say anything, I guess it just becomes easier. Because again, from the Kyoshi novels, we know that like the general opinion on the air nomads is that everyone respects them. They like the people of the Fire Nation want to get like look from an air nomad. That's how they're viewed. That's how like Jinpo was treated in that Fire Nation town.
Yeah.
And in general, there's a level of respect given to them because they are monks and they kind of have a very specific way of life. So it's interesting to see what exactly they'll do here in terms of like Aang really doesn't have any like proof that's going to like immediately change his mind, and I suppose it'll come down to if the Fire Nation guy has any proof himself. But they do have to be careful that they don't get too far into the stuff like you said is said about it in the headband, like because Aang, I definitely think in that moment, the reason he responds to the question is because he's like hearing about it for the first time. So I don't think the soldier can mention this idea of like the air nomad having a military. But we'll see
Mhm.
exactly what they do here. But do you have any thoughts about like what way they're gonna go about doing this plot?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, would they hint at anything that we do know that comes up later on, or if there's some other like way that they're gonna say like there were signs of, the air nomads planning to sort of attack the other four nations or something along those lines that can sort of be like a precursor to the reason why they had to make like the first strike, and they did it on the day that they would be the strongest because that would help them defeat the air nomads or something like that. Like what's going to be what is now the current revisionist history of that whole sort of incident. I don't know, that's interesting. I mean, of course he could just like in theory he could pull out a textbook, and for whatever that actually is worth, that would be enough as far as like a Fire Nation, person would consider as far as like this is what it is, and what is there around the world to really sort of counter that. Now we know there probably are sort of like some sort of secret pockets or hidden societies that do have probably the correct sort of history. We probably can think more of that now that we have sort of other stories, but how no one's going to know that. So yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how they try to tiptoe around that situation and if it's going to do anything. I mean, I don't know. I think it might be interesting if this, one random person here, somehow becomes like just on decent terms with Aang just because of his character. Like I could see something along those lines working rather than actually being able to prove anything real in sort of history. Like maybe just his actions will prove, more than what he's learned growing up. That might be a nice way to go about it.
Mm. Yeah, one of the pages that someone online managed to find does, I think, address this to some degree. Again, it's just one panel, a picture of it here. And
Mm.
Aang says he's not changing his mind about the air nomads because of a poster. So I guess the guy has a poster that says something about it. I'm
Mm.
guessing it's Aang's wanted poster and what the description is about him. So, because we know that there is wanted posters for Aang, and I guess this
Yeah.
will reveal the
Yeah.
details of that and what it says about him, that like, oh, he's dangerous or in some way. I don't know what exact terminology they're gonna say about it or anything like that. But I'm not sure because none of the present day Fire Nation military have ever fought an airbender, so like I guess there's just that inherent like danger of the unknown type stuff going on there. But I don't know. What's your take about that? A poster keeping him like that's why he feels that way about the air nomads.
I mean, that seems like a plausible reason enough for someone who's grown up in the Fire Nation and already has that sort of like instilled in them. I mean, there's, what was it? There's like so many, they mentioned like the rumors about like what the Avatar or Airbenders can do, like, like run like the wind or whatever. And then Aang actually does run like the wind past them or whatever. So there are like little things like that, could instigate to prove his point, as far as, air nomads and the Avatar, being bad from that regard. So I don't know, that would be interesting. How would Aang counter something like that? Because I mean, you tend to believe what's written in paper or that you hear, even if you don't have like an actual source from it, depending on how you brought up and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm guessing the situation they're gonna go for is that well, this guy spotted them now, so they kind of have to keep an eye on him until they find their way to Katara. Otherwise, they just have to like either leave him there where he could like be there forever and get injured, uh, because they can't just let him go back to his people. Otherwise, like he'll just inform everyone that like they're around in the area. Uh, I don't know how much time this is going to take up across the whole book. Like, is Aang after finding out about this poster going to come around and like convince him in some other way? I'm not sure. Because like he doesn't really, apart from like his glider and Appa, like he doesn't really have any other air nomad like stuff on him, and if he anything he says about history is just going to be denied by this guy. So I don't know. I wonder will they reference maybe relics in any way? The fact that Aang knows that like the Fire Nation use air nomad
Yeah.
items to hunt down survivors of the genocide or anything like that. Um, like I don't know, like it could be interesting just for him to point out that like like what about the Enema genocide? Like, do they call it that or what? Like, how can you justify like killing an entire people or something like that? I don't know if they'll get into that because they don't really seem to want to talk about it, but it could be something interesting. But we'll move on. So the next couple of pages is Katara again gets out of the ice ball and she finds herself next to this sort of a small coastal Earth Kingdom town that has like a dock on it, and there's some Fire Nation people here. Um, Let me switch over to the other preview here that has more of the pages. And yeah, she just realizes that like, okay, are they keeping people in or keeping them out? And she realizes, okay, they're definitely keeping the people in so that the Fire Nation can basically control this whole port town. They immediately spot Katara because she's wearing clear like blue Water Tribe clothing, but she immediately takes out this guard by just basically uppercutting him with some ice. And then she really sneakily just drags his unconscious body into the bushes to hide it. So she does get to prove how tough she is here. She just like KOs a guard and hides him in the bush, and then she takes I suppose a sheet from a line somewhere and wears it to cover up the obvious Water Tribe clothing, which is where the Hollywood Reporter preview starts at this point. Which is where she's just walking through the streets of this town, and these how many people is it here? 4 people come up to her. They kind of confront her either side. She warns them that she's going to defend herself, and yeah, they basically get into a conversation back and forth about like they saw her do waterbending, but they're not quite sure if they saw exactly what they saw. So Katara's being very coy about the situation. She interrogates them a little bit to try and get information, and they want a waterbender on their crew. They have a ship, and that's what they need a waterbender for, because the Fire Nation is around, so they could use a bender to defend themselves, and she just demonstrates her abilities. So it's a fun little scene. She just takes water out of a pouch and splashes it on one of the other guy's head, and so this confirms that she's a waterbender. I suppose captain here introduces herself as Jiang, Jiang, and her ship is called the Flying Wolfbat. And Katara gives her own name, and we just get this situation where they say, oh, good that you're actually a waterbender, because someone else claimed they were a waterbender but was a fraud, so they basically put him out into the area where the moose line was from the previous episode. So another reference to something that's recently just happened, that this area is known for having these animals around. And obviously Jiang lies to Katara about exactly what they did, but it's just to prove that yeah, they're more sort of cruel than they're letting on. But that's the Hollywood Reporter preview here. So what are your thoughts on this as the direction they're going in? So this confirms to us that the pirates are not the ones that we know about from the show, from like 109 and so on. Different pirates, and we have this female pirate captain, but they haven't announced themselves as pirates just yet.
I think it's cool. I think it's pirates in the show have always been pretty interesting so far. So the fact that we're being introduced to a new group here, I think is a nice sort of dynamic that we get to see. And since we have no prior knowledge of them, we get to learn them as Katara learns about them. So they definitely seem like an interesting group here. I wonder if there's any more to them, and when the final reveal happens, what Katara is going to think about that. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how this whole thing sort of plays out. But the setup for it, I think, it works well enough. They need a waterbender. Katara's a waterbender, and they're pirates on the sea, so it all fits into place fine enough. It's just sort of how do they take it from here is really going to be the interesting point.
Yeah, like the character seems interesting enough. I've seen some people sort of freaking out, like because they like the design. I think we still have to wait to see what exactly the approach is with the character, to see what they're actually about, because like we still haven't really got into the whole like and the pirate silver bit just yet, in that okay, they're going like downriver, to what intent? Like this pirate
Yeah.
silver, like how does it relate to? I think at this stage it seems clear that they're going to, I guess, find some way to maybe free up this town because they bring up the barricade from before. Um, so it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen here. Like, will they just knock down that barricade and that'll be that, or are they going to have to ignore this town? Will the silver be used to aid the town in some way? Um, I'm not entirely sure because like that's probably where the actual like plot and interest in this side of the story is going to come from. Because
Mhm.
I've seen a few extra pages. I can't access them now because I was messing around with the URL and got a couple of extra ones. Pretty much just after this, it seems like what happens is that they get her involved in the plan. They give her some Earth Kingdom outfits, and based on what they say, she suddenly realizes that, oh, I've agreed to help out basically like a criminal group in whatever they're doing, and so the thing going from here is how does she adapt to maintaining a toughness level to kind of keep herself going while she's with these pirates. Because I suppose Katara is strong enough to defeat all of them, but on a ship, in close quarters, she has to, keep her wits about her. Um, but I definitely want to know what the deal is with the silver. Like, do they need a waterbender to get into wherever this silver is? Is it like a lost treasure, or are they just like escorting money somewhere? Depending on what the scenario is, it'll be much more or less interesting. But I suppose, what are your thoughts on that, or like your expectations of it? Like, okay, once they introduce themselves as pirates, what would you sort of like the approach to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of Katara figuring out how to maintain the status quo that she has with them will probably be, the challenge for her as a character, and her, generally being on the kinder side of things, depending on how, I guess, ruthless this group actually is, and what their actual, what they're willing to do to achieve their goals. How far are they willing to go? I mean, I'm going to assume it's not going to be anything like super drastic, but I'm sure it's going to put Katara in a couple uncomfortable situations that she's going to have to figure out. What can she do? What can she sort of get away with? Does she has to do something sort of like behind their backs? I mean, I don't know. It definitely could be interesting to see how this plays out, just because of, what she has to do, or, I don't know, maybe these will be people that, somehow come into play later on. Maybe that'll be interesting too, just to see, what sort of, I guess, sort of like end possible sort of friendship, she has with these characters, or if this is just going to be one of those sort of side stories we never sort of hear about ever again.
Yeah, I think with the presentation here, it's all about like, are we meant to view these as being like an actual criminal organization that, like, yeah, Qatar's going to have to get through it and then we won't see them again? Or are they going to be more of a freedom fighter type thing where it's like, okay, sort of
Yeah.
potential allies because they're both against the Fire Nation. They're not as bad as the other pirates, or whatever. Um, it sort of feels like, the Dao Fei, like which style of Dao Fei are they more like the Yellowneck style Dao Fei or the Flying Opera Company style Dao
Yeah,
Fei?
exactly.
Um, that'll be what's interesting to see. Um, I don't know. Maybe it feels like they want a waterbender for more reasons than just defense. Because I suppose on sea though, waterbender is ideal. In that, like, if
Yeah.
they're Earth Kingdom people, earthbending's not going to be great ship to ship unless they weigh down the ship with a bunch of earth. Um, we'll see exactly what happens here. Is like Katara gonna learn anything along the way here? A new technique? I guess it'll be something about like she'll learn how to use waterbending to assist with like sailing in some way, maybe. But I don't know. It depends. Like, are we actually gonna get like a pirate adventure in this, like where we go to some different island to get some treasure, or are we all about doing something in relation to this town? That's what I'm not sure about just yet. Um,
Mm.
the other thing would be, I suppose, coming more towards the end of the book, is that obviously Katara has to reunite with the rest of the group, and she's going to tell them that, like, this is what I did. Are we going to end with like Katara saying that, when I was on my own, I joined a pirate group and won the day. Toph obviously isn't going to like believe that. So unless they see Katara doing what she's doing at the end of the book, no one's really going to believe that. And so, how are you going to like finish off the character arc with regards to like, it may just be us, like Katara and us as the audience, who are aware of what's happened when you're trying to prove to Toph, how tough Katara is. That's what could be a little bit tricky, and like, how is it exactly going to come together? I would guess, like you suggested earlier on, that with the soldier, he'll probably see Aang either helping him in some way, or like maybe helping the other Fire Nation guards, like not get like super injured by the pirates or something like that, and that will be a proof that like Aang is more peaceful and that he has the air nomads all wrong. I'm not really sure. How do you think they're going to bring the two plots back together at the end and create some sort of a meaningful arc out of this?
Yeah, that is a tough one. I mean, I wonder if they're going to go the route of, where it's just sort of like more introspection, as far as like Katara realizing that she is tough and she doesn't need, tough, sort of like approval or anyone else's approval to really show sort of how tough she is. That could be one way to go, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did something where, like you mentioned, like there is some sort of big clash between the two sort of sides, and that's what sort of shows, sort of the toughness of, Katara, and sort of the kindness, or sort of, the true airbending way that Aang has, and that sort of like levels out, sort of the playing field there, as far as like what the actual two conflicts are of this actual comic here. I mean, it's also, how do you show that to Toph as well? I mean, if it's a whole sort of like sea-based event, how is she going to see that in a way? So I don't know, it'd be interesting to see if they even bother to go that sort of route here, or if it's, something that they leave for later on. Because I mean, we do know that eventually, the respect between Toph and Katara, is there. Based off of previous episodes, so it could be a thing where they just don't do that as much here, as far as actually showing Toph it yet.
Yeah, because there's that short story in the Lost Adventures where I think it's Toph and Katara have to act like boys and be all tough to go into the... I don't think it's a bar, but like some sort of a place like that. And I suppose that they both prove to each other that they're tough in that one as well. I can't remember exactly when that one is set. But
yeah,
I think that's a Guri-Huru drawn one actually as well, if I remember correctly. I think it's like, is it Boys Day Out, or it's probably not called that, but there's something like that. Because Toph doesn't really have any issue with Katara when it comes to like how strong or powerful or tough she is as we go forward. It's more about the motherly side of her that becomes more of the issue later on. So I guess she has to prove to Toph something here. But the last page I have here is one of the previews, is page 30, which is back with the Fire Nation soldier, Toph, Aang, and Sokka. Sokka says to Aang, "Look, we don't need to rush off. I can tell this is important to you, Aang. Katara can take care of herself." And then Toph says, "You just said she was as soft and cuddly as a croco kitten." And so Sokka, who said that earlier on about Katara, actually says, "I was teasing her. It's what I do. It's my job as her big brother. Also, have you seen a croco kitten? Sure, they're pretty helpless at the beginning, but once their scales come in, they could take down a fully grown platypus bear. Maybe not a full-grown platypus bear, maybe a half-grown one," and they show a kind of picture of what Sokka's thinking about, which is just like a small croco kitten chasing off a fully grown platypus bear. But that seems to be the metaphor for the arc that Katara is going to go on here. That we're going to see, I suppose, the way Sokka talked about her at the start is what we know her as typically, but that she can be, sort of when provoked, just as dangerous as a croco kitten with the scales in. I think it's a okay enough metaphor, and like especially the Croco kitten sort of having kind of a connection to Toph, because like the Boulders kitten from the Team Avatar Tales more recently. We'll see how that
Yeah.
goes, but yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like it does seem like Sokka and Toph are sort of both behind what Aang wants to do here. They understand why he would want to, have a little bit of a discussion and argument with this Fire Nation soldier to get a sense for how they actually view the Airbenders, but that he also is presenting his usual view on Katara, where it's just like, yeah, I can make fun of her sometimes, but he knows deep down exactly who she is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice little bit. I mean, that feels like something that probably would happen as far as, Sokka teasing Katara, as far as like how she sort of acts and how she can be this way and that way, at the same time there. So I think that's a nice enough way. I think the point comes across clear enough, because as viewers, we know how tough, Katara really can be. So it's really just Toph who doesn't know as much about them since she hasn't been there as long, the true sort of like character that all of the sort of characters have here. So no, I think that works enough for me. And the fact that Aang is going to try to say, something this way, the Fire Nation soldier, seems like it's pretty in character for what he would do. Whether that's like the most important thing to do at this point, that's sort of up to debate. But so far this seems like what would actually happen.
Yeah, so that's all the preview pages I have seen. I tried to mess around with the Google preview like usual, but like I was not able to get any of the pages past like page like 35 or 36. So I haven't seen anything from the second half of the book, unless the panel I referenced earlier on that I saw online is from the second half of the book. But that's why like I have no clue about the exact like what exactly Katara is doing with this kind of pirate crew, like what exactly they're planning to do, apart from just go on a trip somewhere. So it means we have, I think, just a little bit over half of the book still yet to see. And like I said, we're under a month away from this book. It is the last new piece of content for the year that's not like a reprint book. So there kind of is a little bit of pressure on it, because comic-wise, there's only been one comic this year, is The Empire Part 3, which was very good, but we have been waiting, but by the time this Katara comic comes out, it will have been over a year since Imbalance Part 3, the last Avatar comic. So that sort of is, I think, is where the problem comes in, of like you have switched the main creative team over to doing this completely different format of books, which is something the fandom's been asking for, but it was in addition to still continuing the story. And it will be very interesting to see once we get this, what the real reaction is, especially if they, at the time, haven't yet announced any other Avatar comics. Like I said at the start, I am just a bit worried that it'll come out, people will like it, but it's not going to have the impact that the usual mainline series actually have, because we are so far away from new content that we are kind of asking eventually the comics to get to a point where we can see, Sokka, Aang, Katara, Toph, everyone, when they're older, like when they're adults, and we still feel the need to jump backwards to tell not particularly necessary stories in between the books as like the mainline series. So that's why I think there's like a lot of pressure on the next core comic announcement to hopefully they don't take this exact approach with the core comics. I think that would be a big mistake at this point to go away from trilogies for Korra as well. I think one-shot stories can work, but they need to feel more important than this, because I think they can tell a good story in 72 pages, but they have to have more to them than Toph and Katara have a difference of approach. So Katara has to prove herself that she's tough. That seems a little simplistic considering some of what we can actually do. But what are your thoughts going into this? How do you think this book will go down once it comes out, with regards to, I suppose, just the rest of the lineup, the fact that we still don't know what's happening with Korra comics. They haven't made any note to say that there are there is a follow-up to Imbalance coming or anything like that.
Yeah, it definitely does seem like there's a lot on this one shot book, at least from the perspective that we're coming from, having, read everything so far and, wanting to see where, I guess, the core, progression of our characters actually lie, to go backwards a bit. And I mean, it's cool to sort of fill in the gaps, but is this necessarily a gap that we needed to have filled in? I mean, it seems like there's like a little bit in it, but from what we've been discussing right here, we're almost more interested in sort of like the B plot to this comic rather than what's the main plot. So I don't know, from that perspective, that doesn't seem like such a strong way of telling a story in a comic, where the B story is what seems to be more interesting. So I don't know. I wonder how well it's going to do overall. I mean, I can't see, the story like bombing or anything like that. Like, it's going to be cool. The art looks, great and amazing as always. So from that perspective, there's no foul or any harm coming from it. It's just sort of like a use of resources. Is this the best possible way that you could have gone, with the comics at this point? Or is there, I mean, there's like so many different factors that, play into the production of these things that, we're not privy to at all. So I'm sure there's like a zillion other factors. But from what we're, seeing so far, I mean, I don't see this having sort of like the longevity of, the other comics that we have so far. Like, there's probably not going to be a huge, reason to sort of like recommend this book over any of the other ones that we have so far, unless you're like really, 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 really into Katara and her character.
Yeah, and I think that's just the situation here. Like you said, it's just sort of like, is this the best use of resources? Is this the best use of, like, I suppose, more or less, I suppose, 6+ months of this creative team's time is to tell this story, versus you could have got them to tell a much more important story. And I think we know, because I think Peter Wortman just recently on Twitter confirmed that he's finished the art for the Toph comic, because he says he's done now art for 5 Avatar comics. So Toph Beifong's Metalbending Academy, I guess, is done as far as he's concerned. I guess that means there's still some coloring work and stuff like that to be done, but for the most part, it means that that book is very, very close to being finished. In the 3-4 months away until release of that book, which obviously is the follow-up to this. I think we have to keep in mind that, like, obviously the plan recently is the one that's been in place for quite a while before we knew that Mike and Brian had left the Netflix show. Things might change as we go forward into the next couple of months, as we find out what exact role Mike and Brian are going to find themselves in within the franchise now that they're not working on other stuff. Are they just going to be assisting on projects like usual, or is there going to be more of a sense of like, yeah, no, we're doing something big now going forward? You might see that happen, I suppose, it probably will be the end of 2021 where we begin to really see the results of if they are more heavily involved or not, because we're getting Toph Beifong's Metalbending Academy next. There's some sort of Korra comic coming, and we pretty much highly expect there to be at least a third one-shot comic. So I suppose we'll really briefly get into this. So just that Toph Beifong's Metalbending Academy, I believe, was stated to take place, I think it was either just before or just after the Rift. So it's in or around that time period. So it's in the comic timeline, which is more of what we want, but it's not post Imbalance. And then obviously the main thing with that, I think, is that we now know it's going to involve Earth Rumble and potentially the Earth Rumble characters, as well as Chong and the other nomads. So at least that's sort of interesting, that we're going to get to see some of the more minor characters. We'll get to see Toph's students, her main 3 students again. And I think that that's just a little bit more interesting straight away, just because you're covering a time period that isn't as fleshed out as the show ATLA. We're dealing with a lot more interesting stuff just with that, and like Toph messing around with the Earth Rumble, Sokka messing around with the nomads. That seems a little bit more fun than potentially some of what's going on here. I suppose what are your thoughts on just like even just the change up from the first one shot to the second one shot? Do you think it's an improvement what the Toph comic looks to be?
I think as far as where it's placed in time, I think is definitely an improvement. It's still going backwards, so there's a little bit of a downer there. But the fact that we don't know, I don't know that at least it is in the future. It is developing on something that we don't really know that much about. Even in like sort of like the future timelines or like even core, like we don't know that much about her metal bending academy. Like what does it eventually turn into? The sort of like all the different students. Like how did it get to that level, or was it already at that sort of level? Sort of like the inner workings of her what she's doing as a character seems pretty interesting since that's like a blank sort of slate. We don't know how that part of her life has progressed. Like we do know, that she becomes the chief of police and, other characters and her daughters and stuff like that. But this one part of it, we don't know as much. So from that perspective, at least from my opinion, it seems more interesting. Granted, it's still, not pushing the whole overall core story of all our characters forward, but it's, working towards that direction. So, I mean, if it were to keep up this sort of like trend of like the next one would be sort of like another character's story further on in the line of the comics, maybe it still might not be at like the end of, the current, sort of series of comics, but closer to it, I think that would be leading towards like a more interesting storyline or progression than what we currently have from just Katara's story right now. So maybe that's sort of like the trend that they're going for, which in that case, I mean, that's a better way of doing it. Although maybe it would have been nicer to start with one of the other ones that's more farther down the lines rather than going all the way back to the original series. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, because I think the thing is that like I think there's potential in setting stories in the middle of ATLA. Like we saw that in that some of the Lost Adventures stories that are set in really interesting time periods are very, very good. Like especially like in between, say, book 2 and 3. There's like the bridge going home again as well. Those two are like you have to read those to see Katara's thoughts on what happened in between, to see like Mei and Zuko kind of get together in between the two books. Like they feel important. This one, the Katara one, we obviously just discussed here. It's like okay, they fit it in between the right two episodes, but they did that because this would affect things the least. Because we're about to get into the super heavy plot stuff in book 2, and we've just left the sort of introduction of Toph section of the story behind. So here's your gap to do whatever you want. At least with the Toph comic, they have some potential just because it's like, oh yeah, like it'll be our first time seeing a lot of these kind of more minor characters in the comic timeline. But the fact that the title is about the Metal Bending Academy, and it almost feels like we can't in any way touch on what we eventually want to see with the academy, which is, I suppose, how it maybe eventually turns into a police academy, or I don't really know. We don't even know that that's the case, actually. Just that Toph brings metal bending into the police force. I don't think it necessarily says that her academy has to turn into being about police, because I suppose Toph would have to get training herself to be a police officer, and when's that going to happen? But yeah, the rumored, I suppose, I don't even know how confirmed it is or not, third one shot, because the reason we think there's going to be a third one shot is because they're going to have to collect these at some point into a library edition, because now that we know they're doing that for even the short stories, they're going to do one for these ones. So they have to do a third one at least. What characters is it going to be about? I don't think it's going to be about Aang necessarily, because he's the main character, and at that point it might as well just be a mainline story. There's no need to do like a one shot for Aang unless it's like something super, super important. I almost think Zuko is almost in a similar case as like sort of the secondary main character. There might not be a willingness to do that just because he's been on the cover of comics. He's been the focus character for the comics before. whereas it hasn't been as much the case with, say, Katara and Toph getting the spotlight on the cover. Um, that said, the Rift and North and South were more or less focused on those two, but I think what most people would want out of a third one would be the Zuko focus. And even if you only set it like in between some of the comics, that's interesting because we like to see the Fire Nation during these interesting time periods, and especially if it was said even before Imbalance or during Imbalance, it would be time for Zuko to like interact with Ki now that she's a firebender. Even if you're not telling the important Azula story on that side of things, it would give you an opportunity for like Ki, Ursa, Norin, Iroh, all these other characters we really care about to play more of a role in the story. And I think especially Zuko's dynamic with Ki, and that he could start her firebending training. We haven't seen like Ursa's reaction to her being a firebender yet as well. That's something we want to see because it's not hitting the most important plot, but it's something. It's getting there close. Because I have seen some people speculating that maybe there'll be a Zula one shot. Based on the first two, I really question them doing something that important. But what would be some of your thoughts on what the third one shot will be about?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I don't. From everything that we've heard, I don't think they want to touch Azula at all. With all the stuff around what could go with her character. But the idea of doing something in the Fire Nation, I mean, that seems like that could be plausible. Just because it is, more home base. It doesn't really need any of the other characters. We can see, primarily stuff with Zuko's new family here and how that whole dynamic works out, sort of being part of the royal, Fire Nation and everything like that. So that seems like that would be interesting, and it wouldn't require, I don't know, I feel like it doesn't require too much other sort of like external like influence. Like it can be pretty self-contained without, seeing what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, there can definitely be sort of like mentions and stuff because, this is after the war and there still is all of that sort of like issues to deal with. But as far as like the family's concerned and getting, acclimated to their new life, that would be interesting to see. I don't know if they would, sort of branch off of, Toph's story with the Metal Bending Academy and have something with Sokka and Suki, just sort of like branching off of that sort of storyline there, but maybe pushing it farther down in the comic sort of timeline. Like still not like, I don't know, it doesn't feel like they're going to want to go anywhere forward until they're ready with like another like 3-part story, but somewhere farther down in the comic sort of timeline, something that has to deal with Suki and Sokka that maybe sort of branches off of the current story that we get with Toph. That might be, I don't know, something that would be worth interesting and exploring. And since everyone always wants more stuff with Suki in like sort of a more mainstay fashion, that might be something that would be worth exploring. I mean, I don't know, sort of her as a character, is that maybe like too minor for the threshold, but maybe having her with Sokka would be enough to have both of them? I don't know.
Yeah, because that's always the question with these one shots of like, they know a book will sell with Katara on the front, with Toph on the front. Is like, we know there's like the hardcore fan base loves Suki, but to the more casual fan, which would make up most of the sales, would a book with just Suki right in the front be enough to sell a book? And that's where like, yeah, you probably would have Sokka also on the cover with her, because of course you'd want the two of them to be in the story together. I think that would be fine, because I guess it's just another way of doing sort of a Sokka focused story, but this time it's like Suki maybe leading the story. And I think that's probably the other one that would feel the most sort of like what they're going for here. Especially if they're only like the B plot in the Toph book. I could see that being one way to do it. But again, what story do you do? Because I think most fans have similar ideas about the stories that like they would do if they were allowed to choose the stories for the one shots, and that it would be like, okay, Solo Aang's story where he finds the other Sky Bison, because that has to happen at some point. That's where Oogie and stuff like that come from. But the problem with that is that we don't know when in the timeline that happens. That could be 10 years from now, it could be a year from now, it could happen very, very shortly. We don't know. Similarly with Zuko and his dragon, Druk. where does he get them from? Like, how old do dragons live? Um, is it the Sun Warrior egg and stuff like that? But there's a story there because people love dragons, and seeing Zuko and just setting up early on in the comics that he has a baby dragon, I think it's just such a cool idea, and I'd want them to do that sooner rather than later. Like that's one of those things where I wouldn't want them to like skip ahead and like Zuko only gets Druk when he's like 30 or 40 or something like that. Um, and then Sokka and Suki, I think most people are like, can he find his space sword again, or make a new one or something like that? Because we I think we pretty much know from a lot of the portrayals of him when he's older, at least the Old Friends poster, that he gets his sword back. I don't think we know for sure it's a meteorite sword, but he gets some sort of a sword back, and he doesn't have one currently. Yet he is a swordsman, so just for Sokka to be at full power again, I think we want him to get his sword back, and why not have the two of them go look for it? It's a way to do an adventure, and even if it is just like a simple thing of like someone's found it and is using it, and Sokka has to have a fight with the guy to get it back, that seems fine. He might have to do some training to counter it or something like that with Suki. There's a story. But I almost feel like they don't want to do any of those important ones that people care about, but I don't really know. But yeah, I suppose, what are your thoughts on some of that stuff? Like, why do you think they're almost like avoiding touching on some of those bigger topics that feel more important?
I don't know. That is a good question. I wonder if it's because it pushed them too far down the path of what they aren't ready to sort of decide, as far as like if they were to do sort of future stories, that and they have to make sure that these potential stories that we're more interested in sort of like line up more so in the timeline, like basically just trying not to cause any like continuity errors with what they may want to do in the future. I mean, I don't know. I think there's still the danger in that, with regardless of what they're sort of doing, but maybe they're more hesitant on that sort of like train of thought, or they want more involvement from Mike and Brian before they do some more of the sort of detailed stories, which maybe before they didn't have as much of a access time to them, but now maybe they do have the time, so now maybe they are more willing to sort of go with those stories, or maybe there are other sort of like rights issues involved in sort of going with those sort of more, I guess, interesting stories that would push things farther down the line. I don't know. There's a lot of different things that could be there, I guess.
Yeah, that's why probably it is a good thing that Mike and Brian aren't working on the Netflix show anymore. Hopefully we'll see with upcoming comic announcements a shift to stories being more important, because like we saw that relatively recently, like Runes of the Empire told an important story with developing Kuvira in the way that they did. That was a big character shift that they've done there, developing on from book 4, and hopefully they can continue that with the core comics, which obviously have the sort of benefit of being like the furthest into the franchise we can go. There's no gap that they're eventually going to sort of meet up with, like the Avatar comics are. That said, I think they've got so much room with the Avatar comics in the timeline, like 70 years, that they shouldn't really have that much of a problem. Given that they're doing so much of the Republic City setup like this early on, I don't. That's why I think. I don't think it's that big of a deal, like the kind of continuity points and stuff like that. If you start like Toph doing like police training at this point, acknowledging that it will take a few years for her to get good enough to be given a position like that, once you write it well and somewhat logically, I think it's possible to do it. Because like I don't think they're really ever going to get too specific and be like, in this year post Air Nomad genocide this happens and that sort of thing. Like they never address that stuff, and that we still don't know what age the characters are exactly in the comics right now. In that, like, by my count, Aang isn't even 16 yet. But I don't know. I suppose just really quickly, like, what are your thoughts on that? As of imbalance, what age do you put, like, say, Aang, Toph, Katara, Sokka at?
Yeah, like that's a good question. We never do really get like our real like sort of like true ages. I mean, we know, I don't know. I mean, I always just considered them more sort of like in sort of like the mid range of the teen years because they haven't. I mean, they definitely haven't fit. Like sort of like full like maturity or anything like that. I mean, Zuko is obviously like the closest one as far as that goes. But the rest of them, I mean, Aang is still, Aang and Toph are, still the youngest ones by far. And I don't know, it just doesn't seem, I don't know, maybe that's just like one of those things they're really waiting for that big sort of like jump to sort of like age the characters up because they know that that's like a big thing that people are sort of looking for. I mean, I remember when they did do like their more recent designs, and they announced that sort of like online, and it was like, yeah, they're a little bit different, but it's still not that much different from when we've seen them during the show. I don't know, I just remember that being like a thing that was noted, and it was like sort of big, but not really that big of a thing. So I don't know, maybe that's something that they're really sort of like banking on doing. I don't know when, but sometime.
Yeah, because the timeline's kind of weird because obviously at the end of the series, like, okay, Aang is 12 during the series. We assume at some point he hits 13. There's then a year time skip as we go into the promise. Like they directly say it's a year time skip. After that, it starts to get a bit like murky in that like a few of the comics take place like one stems directly into the other, but then there's other ones like I think Spoken Shadow. There's like a couple of months time skip. I think, like you said, when they announced the Peter Wortman designs, I think they mentioned something along the lines of it being like a couple of months time skip again since North and South. So that means that at most, like, 2 years have passed since the start of the comics, which would make Aang 16, but I don't quite think it adds up to 2 years. And again, it's weird because they are doing quite a bit to set up Republic City, like in Imbalance showing them like on Air Temple Island and stuff like that. But it still feels like we're years away from like Aang making the decision to establish an air temple on that island and all this other stuff happening. But it also feels like the sequel to Imbalance isn't just going to be a direct sequel, so whatever they're doing next is going to be something inherently different, so why not time skip at this point? But again, for me, the one thing holding them back from doing a time skip is that you have to address Azula before you do that. Because it doesn't make sense for Azula to be out there causing chaos in the Fire Nation and to skip 2-3 years into the future and just say that, oh, she's still doing the same thing, unless you have a very good reason to do that. So I think Azula comes back to being the point once again of like, you have to tell that story at some point, and it feels like that's potentially what's keeping us at this time. But we also have a writer that doesn't want to write Azula, so it's very confusing. And hopefully now with Mike and Brian back, they can do that, because that feels like the most like important thing of like, Mike and Brian, do you have any idea for like where the Azula character arc is going? Did they have any sense when they started it in like the end of the promise where it was going to end up? I'm not sure. But yeah, I suppose that's one of the final questions, I suppose, before we end here is, what do you think is keeping them in the like characters being 16 to 18 range? What plot reasons are we focusing just directly here and not potentially jumping ahead to like the characters at like 25 or something?
That's a good question. I wonder, I mean, I think one might just be sort of like where they want to go with sort of like the relationships and the couples. That might be something, because that might be, I don't know, something more along the lines of when they're actually ready to sort of like settle down and sort of, I guess, create roots in some sort of location. Despite them still going to have to travel the world, that might be, once they get to that point in the characters' lives, maybe they feel that the characters shouldn't be sort of all over the place at that point, and they want them to sort of, settle down at some place, or, at least push the development of, various places that we do know, happen later on in the story. So maybe that might be the reason why they're sort of like maybe not even like fully intentionally, but just sort of keeping them around sort of like each other for that sort of reason. And maybe it's just another way of sort of keeping the group sort of pseudo together. I mean, they're still sort of like split and some of them are still doing their own sort of things. And, Zuko is obviously always going to be more based in the Fire Nation just because that's, what he has to do. So, I mean, that might be one of the reasons why they really haven't made that sort of jump. That and the whole thing you mentioned with just sort of like Azula's story, that's really going to be sort of like something that needs to figure out from their perspective before they really move anything forward, just so that they have a clear idea of what her role is in the future, or does she even have a role? Because I mean, they could do something where she's just not even a factor, but they have to sort of like establish that potentially ahead of time, unless they do it like retroactively, which tends to not be as well liked by fans. So hopefully they don't go that sort of route.
Yeah, and stuff like that with the relationships is another thing holding them back. Is that, like, can we go to the Fire Nation in Korra and see Zuko and we assume May, but wouldn't that spoil that May and Zuko get back together in the Avatar comics? And like, which of those points has to happen first? And like, does it even matter? Because I think for us as fans, we just want to know that that's the end game ship. Like, why do we still not know in any way at all? And so we kind of have to have May and Zuko get back together, and maybe then it can open the doors to that stuff happening in Korra. But you mentioned the character redesigns for Imbalance, and yeah, I remember that being like a pretty popular thing, because I think I put up like a post on Tumblr, and it still gets likes on my Tumblr to this day. It's just the post with the images of the character redesigns. So my thought process is just kind of like, imagine how excited it would be if you announced for an upcoming comic and showed off the character designs with everyone in their 20s. Because the old friend poster, the images from like some of the more recent comics like Legacy of the Fire Nation that do feature the characters when they're older, they do get people excited. So, revealing the art of what the team looks like when they're adults would be such an important thing, I think, especially at this point. Just knowing that, we're actually finally going to get a story with the characters at this age. And I think they have that if they really want to do it. When they finally do that time skip, they have to know that is going to be an incredibly important thing for the fandom when it finally happens. But we're still a while away from that happening. But yeah, that's most of what we wanted to talk about here. Just a big preview on Katara and the Pirate Silver, and some speculation about where things could go from here. But yeah, we'll of course be reviewing Katara and the Pirate Silver when it's properly out. We'll do a big review for that. But yeah, other than that, we're just waiting for news on the next Korra comic, more novels and stuff like that to happen. But yeah, that has been episode 219 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.